Good afternoon and welcome to Remote Rundown. I'm Jim Reese, Director of Business Development at Offit Kurman, and I'm joined here by our employment attorneys, Sarah Sawyer, Veronica Yu, and Russell Berger. And we're going to talk about the latest and most relevant employment-related issues related to COVID-19 and advice for business owners and employers on how to best deal with these issues. There have been plenty of developments since last week. So Sarah, how about kicking us off with today's discussion?
Thanks, Jim. Appreciate it. So something I've been getting a lot of questions about from my clients recently is, and that there's been new guidance on, is what to do with employees that are either displaying COVID-19 symptoms, they've come in contact with someone with COVID-19, or they've traveled outside of the state to a hotspot. And so CDC guidance has been updated recently on this and is getting a little bit more fact specific just based on what they know about the disease and about the outbreak. So there's definitely been some changes to policies and things for different businesses that I'm working with. So it's the amount of quarantine time that people need to stay home or need to await test results is really going to be really dependent on whether they're showing symptoms, whether they've come in contact with someone. So, for example, the CDC is treating people who have been in direct contact. So they've been within 6 feet of someone with COVID-19 for 15 minutes or more, and there's some other factors like that. Living with someone with COVID-19, they're treating those people differently than those who maybe have symptoms and then their symptoms go away. So people who've come in contact with someone with COVID-19 may have to quarantine for longer time periods, and they're recommending, even if there's a negative COVID-19 test, that they still should quarantine for 14 days. Since symptoms take time to come on, and I think there's been some issues with people getting tested too quickly. So they've also given some additional guidance on the definition of quarantine versus isolation. A lot of people have been using those interchangeably, whereas the CDC is using quarantine as people distancing themselves from the general population because they might be sick. Whereas isolation is described as, you've got the virus and you are in a sick room in your house and isolating away from other people in the house, and different instructions like that. So there's been a lot of updated guidance, and it really just goes to show that we really need to be all vigilant and paying attention to new guidance. And there's a lot of good tools out there on the CDC's website. They've got good examples, and they've got some calendars and things like that you can say, all right, I was in contact with someone on this day, here's what I do, or I was in contact with this person on this day, and then again, what do I do then? Or I'm unable to isolate myself from my husband who has it, and just a lot of different guidance in that regard. And so, really great resource for both employers and employees when businesses are getting these questions from their employees about what to do and how to handle it.
And I think the tab on the CDC website is called, if you're sick or if you're feeling sick. It's just one of many tabs that is on the CDC website. So Sarah makes a great point that it's a really useful resource with practical information like these hypotheticals. I think there's 5 or 6 hypotheticals on whether you live with someone and you have to come into contact with them, or if you can avoid them and put them in another room. And so these are great ways to kind of apply whatever facts you may have with these hypotheticals. And while they might not address everything, they can give you an idea of how it's being handled or suggested to be handled. And also, I thought it was interesting that the guidance addressed people who already have had COVID. And those individuals still have to quarantine if they have a potential risk of exposure. And I think that's one of the common misconceptions that I'm still hearing as of last week. Oh, don't worry, I already got it, or I was probably exposed already, so in a couple months, I can go travel freely because I've already been exposed. And we just don't have the science at this time to know that that's accurate. So I think that's a really good emphasis, that people who may have already been exposed are still at risk and putting others at risk.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, which I think really leads to, some practical advice here. If you have a COVID-19 policy already in place, if you've already distributed something to your employees saying, here's how we're going to handle these different types of situations, the underlying guidance has changed and it's evolved. So it's probably a good time to go back and look at what you have on paper to the extent you already have it, because you might need to revise it. And if you don't have something on paper, now's a good time to put a policy in place so that when these various different situations arise, you know how you're going to handle them and your employees know how you're going to handle them. Um, and I think another thing along those same lines that is becoming a real topic of conversation right now, because we're getting closer to it, is what are we going to do when the school year starts and children aren't going to school? And, some daycares may be open. So if you have, a preschool age kid, you might be able to get childcare. And if your kid's maybe in high school, the kid could be left at home and employees could still work. What do you do if you've got a 7-year-old kid at home who can't be unattended all day? And how do you get that parent into work? Or how do you even free them up to be able to work? Just we're kind of getting to the point where more and more counties, at least here in Maryland, are conceding that they're going to be virtual school only for at least the first half of the year. So, what you may have put in place as an employer in the spring just to get by, just to get from the middle of March to the end of the school year. Maybe that's another good thing to revisit, because now we're talking about a much longer term. We're talking, in some cases, the counties have already said this is going to be the policy through February. So, we're talking about another 5, 6, 7 months minimum of having the childcare dilemma as part of the COVID crisis. So, it's really something where I think employers can be creative about how they get there, and, have some flexibility. But I think now's, if you haven't done it already, now's, it's necessary to sit down and think about how am I going to maintain operations when I'm going to have, I have parents on my workforce that are going to have to deal with the lack of childcare, lack of school, because not everyone can go out and afford a nanny if that's what they need.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
Russell's point that it's not too late to implement policies, especially, not specifically childcare policies, but remote work from home policies. We've been talking about them since the pandemic hit because that became a necessity. And you may not have put a policy in place yet, but now there's a new wave where we see this being a more prolonged issue, and that you might want to put it might be a good time to now implement those policies if you haven't already, or change your policy if what you've been doing isn't working. Just because they're in writing doesn't mean they're set in stone. So you can definitely take the time to revise them to kind of cover what you've been doing right and what you want to change to do. So yeah, I think it's important to know that you have that opportunity to be flexible and update those policies as needed.
I think since the beginning of this, that was something that we've discussed a lot on the remote rundown, is the being flexible. And I think that we're really seeing it play out here, both with the return to school issue and with the changes in CDC guidance and the kind of ebb and flow of the availability of testing. And so it's really showing how adaptable employers need to be, which really brings me to like my main takeaway from today, which is really that you have to remain vigilant. And we're really seeing that play out now in the fact that this is lasting a lot longer, obviously, than everyone had hoped in the beginning in March. And so if you haven't put policies in place, especially if you haven't put policies in place, I should say, is that really now's the time. It's really here to stay. And if you have put them in place, that you need to continue to be flexible and make changes and remain vigilant on what's happening around us.
Yeah, and I would add, I think throughout, we've harped on flexibility and adaptability. What I would add to that now is really creativity. There are guidelines, there are rules, there are, some hard and fast black and white lines. But after that, there's a lot of room for creativity, a lot of room to solve problems in innovative ways. And so I think that's something that, smart CEOs, smart business owners are going to spend some time thinking and working on, because there are solutions out there that, are going to come from a creative place, that are really going to help businesses get through this time.
Yeah, and I mean, I think you can look at your policy as a solid foundation that you and your employees can adhere to and be on the same page. But inevitably, as Russell's saying, there's going to be a time where you need to be creative and deal with something unprecedented, as we've been seeing things change over the past few months. So having that foundation and then being able to deal with other issues case by case, and at least having a starting point is really great to have the policy. And also, I think remote work comes with managing your employees in a different way. You're managing them from afar. So by having your policy in place, it's a starting point so that everybody's on the same page, and you can use that as a reference when you're managing your employees.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because just managing remote employees is its own unique challenge. So, the more you can do that with policies, the easier it's going to be when you're, trying to have a conversation with someone who's not in the room with you.
I have a quick question before we get to bonus round. We talked a lot about policy handbooks and revisions. So if I'm a business owner and I've got 30 employees, and Offit Kurman wrote this beautiful policy handbook for me 2 years ago, we talked about lots of changes and new guidelines. Do I have page revisions, or I do an addendum to that handbook, or is it completely rewritten? How do I deal with that handbook with all these changes?
I think it's gonna depend on when you've reviewed it last. So if it's recent, you may be able to do some just changes to the policy. They should be holistic though, so you have to take a look at what your current policies are, make sure that the new policies are fitting in with them. And so if there's any interplay between like a new Families First Response Act policy and other policies, or your if you do a travel policy and if that impacts any other policies, you may need to change them as well. It might, if you've already got a remote work policy, you may be changing it to adapt to the current situation. Or it might be a brand new policy. If it's been a long time since you've, if it's been several years since you've had your handbook reviewed, now's a really good time to take a look through the whole thing and really see if there's anything that needs to be updated, especially because new employment laws come out every year. So really, handbook policies are something that are important to stay on top of anyway. We've got some new laws taking effect in Maryland, for example, in October. There's a bunch of new employment laws in Virginia as well. So it's always a good time to take a look and make sure that everything's up to date and that you're not missing anything. And now's a good time to do that. So it's really going to kind of depend on what you're looking at.
Yeah, I would go ahead, Veronica.
No, I was just going to say, I've been suggesting for COVID policy doing an appendix because it's easier to change than changing the main handbook, and you can add in and take out as necessary. So for COVID specific policies, I just thought that is nice to have it in an appendix somewhere.
Yeah, well, and I hopefully anyway, this isn't going to be forever that we're going to have COVID policies. But I always say with handbooks, it's like going to the doctor. They tell you you're supposed to go every year for your checkup. Same concept with the handbook. You should bring it in, you should get it checked out. It's a good way to audit all your employment practices on an annual basis. And if you haven't changed all that much, if you're still relatively healthy, you push it to 2 years. We understand that too. But the doctor's recommendation is always going to be come in once a year and get it checked out. So I don't think we're any different in that regard.
By the way, with the doctor, make sure it's over 365 days in between your visits, right? All right, well, it's bonus trivia round, and we're going to start with Veronica. I think you'll like this question. Veronica, what bad habit or habits have you acquired while in quarantine?
Wearing pajamas all day.
Except for Thursday during remote rundown.
You get me dressed out of bed, Jim.
Okay, Sarah,
I have developed a latte habit. So it's kind of a costly habit. Adds a couple extra calories to my day as well. One of my local coffee shops has remained open and like done a really good pivot for COVID-19 carry out window situation. So when I take the dog for a walk, I can't help but stop in for a nice latte right now, which is quite the habit I've established. It's almost every day.
by the way, it could be worse because if it was an ice cream habit, I know you have a very nice ice cream place not far from you. And
Yes.
that could be dangerous, right?
Yes, the Charmery, they also adapted pretty well, but luckily I just avoid that corner.
Russell?
You know, the fact that I don't have to go to the office the next day kind of makes me feel every night like it's the weekend almost, even though I've spent all day working and I'm, you know, I always end up staying up and working late anyway. But like I stay up like an extra half hour because I'm like, I don't have to go to the office tomorrow. It's not a real work day. It's just a casual work from home day. And of course it isn't, but I stay up, I trick myself into thinking that like pretty much every night.
I think we've all tricked ourselves to thinking that because we don't have the commute, that we can take that time and do something else, but we take that time and we work, right? The commute time is turned into work time. All right, well, this has been a nice, another nice, fun edition of Remote Rundown with Offit Kurman, and we'll see you guys next Thursday.
Thanks, Jim.
Thanks, Jim.
All right.
Bye.